Hello again, Bill Moore here for Radio Vision Network, and I'm here as the host of History for My Grandchildren. Today I want to give you some information, 5 vignettes on some ordinary guys in World War II. I've said it before and I'll say it again. We know all about the generals, where they were, what they ate, what they rode in, what they thought. We don't know the stories of the everyday guys. So I put together 5 short vignettes of 5 local boys. I've entitled it Jersey Boys Go to War. Okay, 2 of them grew up in Pennsauken, went to Merchantville High School, and the other 2 grew up in Burlington City and went to Burlington City High School. The third grew up in Beverly. He also went to Burlington City High School. They were young men, and I mean young men. 2 of them were 16 years old. One was 19, one was 21, and the oldest was considered, when he went away to training, he was called by the other recruits old man. He was all of 28 years old. And we're going to start with the first one. That's my father-in-law, my grandchildren's great-grandfather, and he flew in B-26 Martin Marauders. We've got a picture up now of a Martin Marauder, and I believe those stripes indicate that that was put on, that Martin Marauder flew in support of the Normandy Landings on D-Day. Okay, the Martin Marauder was, as you can see, a twin-engine medium bomber, light bomber, a difficult airplane to fly, one that you had to know what you were doing. You had to have extensive training to fly one of these things. My father-in-law washed out of pilot training, but he became a bombardier navigator and flew many missions in the European and African theaters. Now let's go back to the early days. He graduated from Merchantville High School, which was one of the sending districts, or Pennsauken sent to Merchantville High School. He had an early career with RCA. Before that, he worked on the local farms in the area, and that'll play a role when we talk about what he did after the war. He went to training for the Martin Marauder, the B-26, and their last training was down in Louisiana at Barksdale Field. Interestingly enough, Barksdale, yes, that's the Confederate Civil War general, Barksdale. Now, they had to get their airplanes across the Atlantic. So they had to overfly the Atlantic in their planes. You think, okay, routine, aircraft back and forth, we see them fly the Atlantic every day. Well, when they overflew the Atlantic, that was 1943, that was only 16 years after Lindbergh made the first solo flight across the Atlantic. So it was a big deal. There wasn't any transatlantic passenger service, so to speak. So they flew from Barksdale Field in Louisiana to North Africa with a stop in the Azores. My wife and I were lucky, his daughter, to see the airfield that they stopped at in the Azores. Okay, I was lucky enough later on when I went to South Africa to stop in North Africa. Our plane landed on the airfield that he landed on in North Africa. Yeah, they still existed. I thought that was pretty neat. His first service when they got to North Africa was in support of the campaign for Sicily, and of course bombed in support of the ground troops there. After North Africa was over, after Sicily was secured, he was stationed in Sicily. And I find it very interesting, our favorite pizza restaurant, the owner was born in Sicily and still goes back every year. He lived less than 20 miles from the base that my father-in-law was stationed, just like how close we are to McGuire Air Force Base. I thought that was pretty interesting. Small world that we live in. He later was stationed in England and France, and his aircraft was called upon to support the D-Day landings at Normandy. So I think that the plane that we saw in the photo at the beginning of the show is pretty reminiscent of what they look like over the Normandy Landings. Later on in the war, they flew air support for the Battle of the Bulge, which was the last German attempt at victory in World War II, and a setback, but an ultimate victory for the Allies, the Americans, and the British. He also flew strategic bombing missions over Germany, and he never talked a lot about the war. I spent considerable time with him. He and I were hunting partners for years and years. And he talked one time, he knew how interested in aircraft and World War II that I was, and he said, oh yes, they had German jet fighters, the Me-262s, go through their formation. Well, after he passed away, my mother-in-law gave my wife and me a box of slides. Now, my father-in-law was a great photographer, and here's a whole box full of slides. Well, the first or second slide I picked up, tiny little slide, and you know how little they are. I held it up to the light to see, and you could see that it had been taken out of a B-26. And looked up, and there were two specks off to the left high. And I said to my wife, I said, I know what they are. She said, Bill, how could you tell? I said, they're Me-262s, the German jet fighter. Now, that jet fighter was 100 miles per hour faster than anything we had. It was the advent of modern war. Fortunately, they came too late to make any big difference in the Second World War. Well, I got a magnifying glass out, and I looked, and sure enough, they were two Me-262s diving in on his formation. Now, over the years after he's passed, I've done considerable research, and the general of the German fighters was Adolf Galland, who was quite a personality. He lived many years after the war, and he became friends with many of his former adversaries in Britain and in the United States. And near the end of the war, when those German jet fighters, there weren't a lot of Germans flying Me-262s. And I've wondered, I'm going to do more research, but I bet that may have been General Galland himself in one of those Me-262s. An interesting sidelight. Back to the Normandy landings, one of the other ordinary guys I'm going to talk about was my father-in-law, and my father-in-law's name was Richard Loken, was his brother Herb Loken. Herb Loken was a paratrooper, and Herb Loken made the jump on the night before the D-Day landings. Now, I find it ironic that here were two brothers. One was overhead in a B-26 bomber supporting the landings. The other had come out of a plane to make the landings, or make the landings a little bit better. Now, after the war, my father-in-law had 5 children. He had a small truck farm. He was known as Farmer Dick. He had a long career with RCA as a technician. That was his job, but he was more like an engineer. He probably knew as much as any engineer that they had employed. And later on, when RCA was developing the Aegis system, which was the protection system used today by our U.S. Navy, the over-the-horizon radar, and all the attendant electronics with that, he was involved in the Aegis system. So throughout his life, he kept up with modern technology and was a factor in the defense of the United States. That's the first vignette. The second one was my dad, William E. Moore Jr. Dad didn't like me calling him Junior. I'm the third, and he didn't want to be called Junior, but he was. Dad was 28 when he enlisted, and he enlisted in the Navy. Dad was sent to Great Lakes Naval Training Center, and at 28 years old, the other recruits called him the old man. Sometime during their training, they had a track meet. Dad had run track at Burlington City High School, and I have some clippings. Dad ran the half mile, the 880, and Dad won that track meet. And he told me the story. He said he was huffing and puffing when he came around, and the recruits in his platoon cheered him on, "Come on, old man, come on, old man." And I guess that's what caused him to win that track meet or win that 880 run at Great Lakes Naval Training Center. They wanted Dad to become a Polaroid photographer, a Navy combat photographer. We're going to take a moment after the break. I'll continue talking about where Dad was stationed and what he did during the Second World War. We'll be right back in a short while.
Sub some sizzle. This is the way. The way it's always been. The way it always should be. The way it always will be. Because that's just the way it's supposed to be. Jersey Mike's. Be a sub above.
Simply Gents, located in Marlton, New Jersey, takes care of all your grooming needs, including haircuts, straight razor shaves, massages, facials, manicures, pedicures, and waxing. To find more information or book an appointment, visit us online at www.simplygents.com. The secret weapon of a well-groomed man, Simply Gents.
If you haven't been to Speed Raceway, what are you waiting for? You want to live fast? You want to make every second count? Then grab the family. Round up the guys. Speed Raceway is 100,000 square feet of excitement, whether you're a kid or a kid at heart. Speed Raceway is the place for endless fun all summer long. Log on to speedraceway.com or just get here now.
When it's time for Jersey Mike's to make a really great sub, this is what we do. It's what we've been doing. It's what we've always done. It's what we'll always do. So what are you doing? Jersey Mike's. Be a sub above.
Today's show was brought to you by Alicia Kelly of White Horse RV Center in Williamstown, New Jersey. Alicia is your RV expert. Contact Alicia at alicia@whitehorserv.com or give her a call at 856-262-1717, extension 203. When you think of RV, think Alicia Kelly.
Today's show has been sponsored by Farmers Insurance in Voorhees, New Jersey. To protect your assets and the people you love, call Mike Skoranek, your local Farmers Insurance agent, at 856-336-2553.
We are farmers. Bum, ba-dum, bum, 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 bum.
Okay, we're back with Radio Vision Network. Bill Moore talking about Jersey boys at war in World War II. I was talking about my dad. He enlisted and was sent to training at Great Lakes. He was then sent to Norman, Oklahoma. Yes, this is the U.S. Navy, and you think, what ocean is there? What water is in Norman, Oklahoma? I think that there was a naval air station there because of the weather. Dad wasn't interested in becoming a Navy combat photographer. He wanted to fight. So he was sent to DeLand Naval Air Station right outside of Daytona Beach, and that was the Navy dive bomber training base for the entire East Coast. And Dad became an aviation ordnance mate second class, which meant that Dad took care of the machine guns on the aircraft, and the aircraft that we should see is the Douglas Dauntless SBD, which was the Navy's main dive bomber of the Second World War. Dad also loaded the bombs and any other ordnance that went on the planes. Well, as you can think, DeLand was quite a busy place. They had to qualify for dive bomb training, and the qualifying, there was a lake not far from DeLand, and there was a big ring in the lake, and to qualify as a dive bomber pilot, you had to put 3 bombs out of 5 in that ring in the lake. Now, a dive bomber actually dives on the target and the plane itself is used to aim the bombs. Well, it stands to reason that the closer you get to the target before you release the bombs, the better chance you have of hitting. Unfortunately, some guys waited too late and didn't get to pull up in time and crashed the aircraft. And Dad has told me about the times they had to go out and search for crashed aircraft and recover the aircraft. And he said many times it was kind of sad because the pilot was still in the plane and the pilot was unhurt except for a bump across the forehead where he hit the bomb site when the plane went in. Dad often rode in the rear seat of the Douglas SBD, and there was a rear seat gunner with two .30 caliber machine guns, and Dad went along. He never was sent out of the United States, so he didn't get to go to war, but during the second half of the war he was sent to California for get ready for the Pacific campaign. And he told me about an interesting incident. Dad was in charge of one of the train loads of sailors that were being sent to the West Coast. They were on an old train, a train probably pressed into service because of the need for rail cars during the Second World War. And he said they didn't have any of the amenities. There weren't cushions. There were hard wooden benches. They pulled into a siding near Chicago, and here came this brand new streamliner train, beautiful train, pulled up alongside of them, and they looked, the sailors looked, and the guys in the brand new train were looking down on their old train and sort of laughing at them. Well, the sailors took a good look, and they were German prisoners of war. One of the ironies of war, here the Germans are in a brand new modern plush train, our guys are in an old wooden car. Dad said it was all he could do to keep the sailors that he was in charge of from getting out of their car, going across, and starting a brawl with the German POWs who were sort of making fun of them out of the car. Shows you how well we treated prisoners during the war. Okay, Dad later went on to, after the war, had 2 children, went back to his job at U.S. Pipe, was a cost estimator, and lived a long, happy life after that. The third vignette that I want to talk about is my father-in-law's brother, Herb. Herb was 19, and from all accounts that I've heard, was somewhat of a hellraiser. And that sort of explains why he joined the 82nd Airborne, the All-American Division. The 82nd Airborne was one of the pioneering parachute divisions in the world. The Germans had the Fallschirmjäger, and the British had parachute units also, but the 82nd Airborne and the 101st were our premier units. There's a picture of a parachute drop from a C-47, the military version of the DC-3, and my father-in-law's brother participated in the night jump on St. Mary Glees to support the Normandy landings, the D-Day landings in Normandy, France. They jumped on St. Mary Glees, and if anybody knows about the night landings, they were not quite a disaster, but they were scattered all over and they had a tough time, but they did their job, what they were supposed to do, keep German reinforcements from coming down to the beach and making it tough for the guys on the landing craft itself. Well, one of the stories of St. Mary Glees is one of the troopers, his parachute caught on the steeple of the church at St. Mary Glees. Well, many, many years after, I was night principal at Memorial Junior High in Willingboro, and our lead custodian was a veteran of the 82nd Airborne. And he and I got into many conversations about many different things, but he told me, he said, Bill, he said, that guy whose parachute caught on the steeple at St. Mary Glees was still in the 82nd Airborne in 1964, and he was still jumping. That was 20 years as a trooper with the 82nd Airborne, which I thought was pretty interesting. Uncle Herb wasn't fortunate enough to survive the war. He was killed in the bitter fighting in the hedgerows of Normandy 6 days into the campaign, so he was killed probably about June 12th or 13th. And when you read the after-action reports, unfortunately he was killed by friendly mortar fire in the confusion and chaos of battle. He did not survive. He was killed, died of his wounds. 19-year-old, fresh out of high school with an entire life ahead, and he gave his life in defense of his country. Now the fourth ordinary guy that I want to talk about is my father's younger brother. He was 16 when he and his buddy at Burlington City High School wanted to quit school and join the Merchant Marine. They wanted to go on the run to Murmansk. The run to Murmansk was the supply route which we sent convoys, huge convoys, to supply our Russian allies. Now you're looking at a picture of the ship that he was assigned to later on, but I'm getting ahead of my story. My dad was sort of like his father because Dad was much older and their father had passed. And my dad said to my Uncle Bob, he said, if you're going to sea to fight, you're going on a ship that has guns and that can fight back. So Dad fixed his younger brother's papers so he could join the U.S. Navy. Uncle Bob went to Great Lakes Naval Training Center, and Uncle Bob was assigned to the ship that we just saw, DD-674, the Hunt. The Hunt was in the thick of the fighting in the Pacific. The Hunt's destroyer squadron made night torpedo runs on Japanese battleships and cruisers somewhere near the San Bernardino Straits, not too far from the Philippines. If you know about anything about naval surface warfare in the Second World War, the Japanese were masters of the night. It took the American Navy a while to get used to it, but the American Navy, some of those destroyer runs against those Japanese cruisers and battleships, it was payback time. Uncle Bob's destroyer squadron was assigned to Task Force 58. Task Force 58 was caught in, or part of Task Force 58 was caught in the Great Typhoon of 1944. 3 destroyers had their backs broken on waves in that thing with the loss of considerable number of sailors. The Hunt made it through that. We're going to take a moment now to go to a commercial break and I'll resume.
Sub some sizzle. This is the way. The way it's always been. The way it always should be. The way it always will be. Because that's just the way it's supposed to be. Jersey Mike's. Be a sub above.
Simply Gents, located in Marlton, New Jersey, takes care of all your grooming needs, including haircuts, straight razor shaves, massages, facial, manicures, pedicures, and waxing. To find more information or book an appointment, visit us online at www.simplygents.com. The secret weapon of a well-groomed man, Simply Gents.
If you haven't been to Speed Raceway, what are you waiting for? You want to live fast? You want to make every second count? Then grab the family. Round up the guys. Speed Raceway is 100,000 square feet of excitement, whether you're a kid or a kid at heart. Speed Raceway is the place for endless fun all summer long. Log on to speedraceway.com or just get here now.
When it's time for Jersey Mike's to make a really great sub, this is what we do. It's what we've been doing. It's what we've always done. It's what we'll always do. So what are you doing? Jersey Mike's. Be a sub above.
Today's show was brought to you by Alicia Kelly of White Horse RV Center in Williamstown, New Jersey. Alicia is your RV expert. Contact Alicia at alicia@whitehorserv.com or give her a call at 856-262-1717, extension 203. When you think of RV, think Alicia Kelly.
Today's show has been sponsored by Farmers Insurance in Voorhees, New Jersey. To protect your assets and the people you love, call Mike Skoranek, your local Farmers Insurance agent, at 856-336-2553.
We are farmers. Bum, ba-dum, bum, 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 bum.
Okay, we're back with Radio Vision Network, and I'm talking about Jersey boys going to war, and we're referring to World War II. I was talking about the destroyer Hunt, and my Uncle Bob joined the Navy at 16. Now, consider this. He was captain of a 40mm quad mount. That was a Bofors anti-aircraft gun on the destroyer Hunt. This was as a teenager. Remember, he joined the Navy at 16, so he was a teenage captain. Okay, the Hunt was part of the group assigned to the battleship New Jersey during the invasion of Iwo Jima, part of the bombardment group. And I thought it was kind of neat that the code name for the battleship New Jersey during the Iwo Jima invasion was Werewolf, sort of appropriate for the season, coming appropriate for Halloween. During that battle, things were pretty good for the Hunt. They participated in bombardment. But later on, I'm going to talk about another uncle who landed on Iwo. He made the landings as a Marine. Now back to the Hunt. The Hunt was off Okinawa for the last major battle of the Second World War that the Americans were involved in. And the Japanese had some last-ditch measures. They had kamikaze or suicide planes to crash into American warships. And the Hunt took a kamikaze right in Uncle Bob's gun mount. Fortunately for Uncle Bob, he was off duty at the time, so he survived. And my cousin Mike still has a piece of that kamikaze that landed on Uncle Bob's plane, or that crash landed. Now, as a young boy, I can remember Uncle Bob and my dad and myself in the living room of our house, and I had wooden blocks. They were the equivalent of the Legos of today. And I can remember Uncle Bob laying those blocks out on the living room floor where their destroyers were when they made the night torpedo attacks on the Japanese battleships and cruisers. So I had first-hand knowledge, I think pretty interesting stuff. I realized it then, but I certainly do realize it now as a historian. Uncle Bob survived the war, had 3 children, went on to a long career as an iron worker, and was fortunate enough to retire to Florida, and in his later years went to Alaska with my cousin Mike. Now the 5th ordinary guy that I'm going to talk about is my Uncle Steve. He was my uncle by marriage. He married one of my mother's younger sisters. Uncle Steve was also 16 years old, and he joined the Marines. Went to recruit training at Parris Island, and his outfit, his unit, was assigned to the invasion of Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was within easy flying distance of the Japanese home islands. It was a volcanic island. You have a picture there of the Marines on the beach. It's a sand beach, but it's not a sand beach like we know. It was black sand because it was volcanic sand. And in the background, you can see Mount Suribachi. You can see the smoke caused by the bombardments. You can see the Marines pressing up the sandy slopes of Iwo Jima on the attack. Iwo Jima was the biggest battle that the U.S. Marines were ever in, and one of the hardest fought campaigns. The Japanese had had Iwo Jima, or Sulphur Island as it was called back in the days of the sailing ships, since 1919, since right after the First World War. So they had had plenty of time to fortify the island and get it ready for any invasion. Iwo Jima was regarded by the Japanese as part of the home islands, so they fought extra hard on Iwo. Now, I find that one of the ironies of the war that two teenage relatives of mine were involved in a pivotal battle of the Second World War halfway around the world. One offshore, part of the bombardment group, and the other on the beach doing the fighting. Okay, how ironic. Two boys from Burlington City High School, halfway around the world. Now, what was the strategic importance of Iwo Jima? The strategic importance was that it was a stopping place if any B-29s that were involved, and that was the biggest and best bomber of the Second World War, any had battle damage, they could land on Iwo on the way home. It also was used as a forward operating base for the fighter planes that accompanied the B-29s to bomb the home islands of Japan. So even though it was a small island, not very big at all, in the Pacific, its strategic importance was very much so. Now, I've talked about these five ordinary guys that set aside everything that they did. One of them gave his life to defend our country. Now, jump back a little bit, give you some of the resolve that these guys had. My mother and father sold their house so that my mother could accompany my father to the different places that he was stationed. How many people would have the commitment? They sold their house, sold most of their furniture. Most of them were working at the time. They both had good jobs, so money wasn't an object, but sold everything to defend their country. I think that's commitment. I think it's also commitment when you have teenagers, two 16-year-olds and a 19-year-old, to go to war. 16-year-olds, I'm wondering today, I hope that they would. I hope that they never have to. But would 16-year-olds go? You wonder. It makes you wonder. We've taken a look at the planes that they flew in. These were not early day planes. They were relatively modern for World War II. You've got the picture of the B-26 Marauder, one of the premier planes. There's the Navy SBD, the principal Navy dive bomber of the war. Three out of the five guys were involved somehow with aviation, which I think is interesting. There's a photo again of a C-47 with a jumper coming out, and it looks like at night. So I'm hoping that's a depiction of the night jump on St. Mary-Église. The other one was naval surface, there with the destroyer Hunt DD-674. And just a little aside, I didn't know it until years later, but the Hunt was taken up the Delaware River to Fieldsboro, up to the Doane salvage yard, and the Hunt was broken up for scrap. Well, as teenagers, we had access to boats on the river, and more than once we went up to Doane salvage yard after the salvage yard closed and climbed around on destroyers that were moored up there waiting to be broken up. I bet that unknowingly I played on the destroyer Hunt before it was broken up. Had no idea until I was an adult years later and started doing the research and found out what happened to the Hunt. And yeah, she was broken up for scrap, as were many of the World War II destroyers. I was fortunate enough, after the war, Uncle Steve was my scout leader in Explorer Scouts at the St. Stephen's Church in Beverly, and he knew how interested I was in history. he said, this is a rifle that I brought home from the war. It was a Japanese Arisaka, and that was taken off Iwo Jima. So I held in my hands pieces of equipment that were used in the battle. Uncle Steve never said a whole lot about Iwo Jima, but I was fortunate enough in later years to meet other guys that were Marines on Iwo. And one of them was Harry Sanford, a good friend of ours. Harry Sanford was a short little guy, a nice guy. He was a Marine on Iwo, and he talked about the volcanic sand. He said, Bill, that sand was in everything. It was in our clothes. It was in our food. We couldn't get away from the black sand. And he said at night they'd be in their foxhole and they could hear Japanese in tunnels underneath the island moving around, and they could hear movement. He said it was really weird, a little bit scary that there they were underneath them in their foxholes. The battle for Iwo went on for over a month, and I think there were over 6,000 U.S., mostly Marines, killed on Iwo. So it was a tough battle. But remember that the Japanese were fighting for what they regarded as their homeland, and you can understand. So there's a few of the stories that we had of the ordinary soldier and sailor, airman, that participated in the Second World War. They, as I said before, most of them were fortunate enough to come home, although one didn't. And I'm kind of glad that they came home, because my wife wouldn't have been born if he didn't come home. So again, Bill Moore, History for My Grandchildren. I'm trying to give you some ideas, my grandchildren and anybody else that's interested in looking and listening, some ideas of what went on during some of events which were pivotal in American history. Events which have shaped our country up into and right through today, 2016. Again, please stay tuned for Radio Vision Network, Bill Moore, History for My Grandchildren.
Today's show is sponsored by Hargrove Demolition, your demolition experts. Hargrove is a family-owned and operated business right here in the southern New Jersey area, bringing you 45 years of demolition expertise. Hargrove has all your demolition needs, from emergency demolition service to demolition equipment rental. Hargrove is one of the state-approved recycling facilities right here in the southern New Jersey area. No job is too big or too small for Hargrove Demolition. Contact them today at one of their 3 locations.
When it's time for Jersey Mike's to give a sub some sizzle, this is the way. The way it's always been. The way it always should be. The way it always will be. Because that's just the way it's supposed to be. Jersey Mike's. Be a sub above.
If you haven't been to Speed Raceway, what are you waiting for? You want to live fast? You want to make every second count? Then grab the family. Round up the guys. Speed Raceway is 100,000 square feet of excitement, whether you're a kid or a kid at heart. Speed Raceway is the place for endless fun all summer long. Log on to speedraceway.com or just get here now.
When we make Beyond Natural dry dog and cat foods, we start with real meat as the first ingredient. We leave out corn, wheat, and soy. And we own where our dry food is made. 100%. Can other